You know, when we think of youth ministry, we often think of the leadership of youth ministry in terms of leading kids in Bible studies and on events, maybe leading a volunteer team. But we think, I think, less often about being not in charge of a ministry, but actually being part of a congregation, being a leader within a congregation, which some people have described as a second chair kind of leadership position. How have you found that tension to be between being kind of the first chair leader in youth ministry, but being a second chair leader in the congregation as a whole? How do you manage that tension?
Sure. It's an important role to try to play between responding to the specific needs of the youth ministry that you're trying to develop, that you're trying to grow, that you're trying to educate both kids and grow volunteers through. At the same time, you're under the authority of, depending on your denominational background, of a pastor, and most likely under the overarching umbrella of the congregation. You've got to balance that tension between the two.
What are some of the particular ways that you balance that tension? Are there some kind of tips and tricks that you've learned along the way?
Yeah, I think the first and most important thing to do is be on the same page with your church and specifically with your pastor and the direction and vision the church is heading in. If your youth ministry is heading off in a totally different direction from the church, you're going to have some real issues as you go down the road together. So the first and foremost advice I have is to get on that same page. To do that, you've got to be actively involved in the conversation that's taking place in the larger church. So you can't go isolate yourself in your office and dream up great big dreams for what your youth ministry is going to look like, separate from the dreams and visions that your church is creating for the whole church. What else? So that will involve the need to spend time with whoever the first chair leader at your church is, which is most likely your pastor, and listening to them and learning from them. And that communication change becomes extraordinarily important as you listen to their vision for the congregation and as you reflect back to them how the youth ministry is developing that vision within your own little niche.
I think it's easy to become isolated often in youth ministry in that sense of not being able to be in conversation with whoever is above you in leadership. How can you go about fostering some of those conversations, especially when you have maybe a senior leader who's not terribly interested in taking time out to sit and listen or sit and let you listen to them?
Some of these ideas come out of the book Second Chair Leadership by Mike Bowden and Roger Patterson, and they wrote their book to help folks who were not in charge think about how they can influence the larger vision at the same time that they are directing the vision that they're directly responsible for. So one of the things that they are adamant about is that relationship piece. And if you don't have a relationship with your pastor, then you are not going to be able to get on the same page. You can't expect that you're going to truly have a visionary relationship, one where they see you as a leader and you see them as someone who's impacting what you're doing in your youth ministry if you're not spending time together. And that's probably going to require more than weekly staff meetings where the vision of the church may or may not be talked about at all. So step one is to get to know them, and if they are not taking that initiative, if you're going to be a leader in your church, you have to take that initiative and seek out time with them, go to lunch with them, find out their interests outside of the church and their interests inside the church, and look for ways to engage them in conversation. And through that, they'll learn more about you as well. So if your pastor likes playing golf and you play golf, well, doggone it, both of you probably could use some time off, and 18 holes and 4 hours later, you'll have a stronger relationship with them. But there are other ways, too, to build and strengthen that relationship. You can draw them into your ministry, invite them to go to the high school football game, and and volunteer to show them where the parents from your church sit. And depending on the size of your congregation, they may or may not know those people, but introducing them around, allowing them to participate in the life of high school ministry in your congregation would be an effective way of building that relationship too.
It's interesting. It's almost as if you're saying kind of how we've thought about relational youth ministry is really true, but not just in terms of building relationship with youth, but building a relationship with the senior pastor is part of the relational ministry that we undertake often. As you build that relationship, what do you do if you come to kind of see that you've got a bigger vision or a different vision than the senior pastor that you're under?
Yeah, I think your context in those situations is greatly going to influence how those things happen. Sure, you may have a larger vision for the church and where it needs to go than the senior pastor does. However, God has placed him or her in authority over you, and depending on your denominational background, most likely they are the person who has been ordained or set apart to order that vision. So, unless you want to take on being the pastor of the church, you've got to come to a place where you understand that that is their role, and you can influence that role through your relationship with them. You can influence that role through your relationships within the congregation, within the other staff who are working alongside you to help cast a bigger vision. But ultimately, it's not going to be your responsibility to cast the vision for the entire church body or to order that vision. And therefore you need to bring yourself in line with where that church is headed, which might bring you to a difficult place of realizing that you are not a great fit for that congregation. But there's definitely some things that can be done to help that if you feel like you have a larger vision.
So in some ways you're saying it's the difference between being a vision caster, which we're asked to do for youth ministry at least, the difference between being a vision caster and being an influencer of vision within the whole congregation, within that leadership structure.
Absolutely.
I know that in your personal experience, you have served in one church under several senior leaders, and then there had to come a time in that context in which you knew the people and their concerns and the flavor of the church better. Did you find it difficult for you to be in a kind of second chair leadership position under someone who hadn't been there as long as you?
Sure. I would actually say that it's easier to serve as a second chair leader if you have a servant's heart when you go through the times of transition, because you have information that is actually helpful to the person who is the first chair leader. And if you step out there in the beginning and establish beside them and offer to be a guide, give advice as it's asked for, and do those type things, I found that that's been very helpful in that transition process.
How do you go about voicing disagreements? You come to a place of being in disagreement with a decision that your senior leader is about to make or has made. When, if ever, is it okay to voice those, and how do you go about that process?
Well, it'll depend greatly on who your senior leader is and what kind of space they create for that conversation. You would hope that there has already been conversation where input has been received and there's been a collective process, but not every pastor operates that way. And therefore, if you feel like the decision they're about to make or in the process of making is in poor decision or actually has serious detrimental implications for how you want to go about doing ministry, then direct confrontation in private is the best place to start. You've got to have that conversation with them. And if you've played golf with them for 4 hours, that conversation's probably going to go better than if you only see each other in staff meetings each week. If they know who you are and what your passions are, they probably are already aware that this is pushing against some things that you adamantly believe in. And the more time you've spent with them, the more trust they will have in you, and the more that they'll be willing to listen to what you have to say. But ultimately, it's their call. And part of being on the team and not being the first chair leader is knowing that some calls are in other people's hands, and when the church makes a decision to do this, your job is to then get behind that decision publicly and help the church move forward and not be divisive around those decisions, because if you want to break down trust with your first chair leader, then publicly say that their decision is a bad one, and play the political game of my way is better than your way. And that division will cause not only division in the church and in the ministry, but it'll cause division between you and that first chair leader, which is not.
How do you find outlets for or places and people with whom to speak about kind of this internal tension? You can't go to people in your church often. You don't want to be seen as someone who's breaking ranks or being insubordinate. Is there ever a place to have a discussion about, hey, this is what's going on, I don't know what to do? And
yeah, absolutely. You need a place to vent. I think that's where you're headed with that,
absolutely.
Or even vomit sometimes. And so establishing relationships with other youth ministers who you trust intimately and deeply, having accountability partners. They don't have to be a youth minister. It can be somebody that you respect deeply, who is a leader in your own life that you can go to for advice. But having a place to just say that this sucks, and this is making you anxious, or you're nervous about these things, and getting advice about how to respond, because it's certainly a learning process on how to talk, usually to somebody who's older than you. The longer you've been in youth ministry, the closer you are in age to the people who are over you, and the easier those conversations get. But when you're the 22, 24, 26-year-old, they certainly look at you like you're the kid, and getting advice on how to talk through those things. If you're going into a situation where you want to confront your boss about something, practicing that confrontation and how that conversation might go with somebody else would make a lot of sense. So other youth ministers can be helpful in that regard, but also somebody who might be a mentor or leader in your life can provide an outlet to do that too. And I'm not sure that it can't be somebody in the congregation, but if it is somebody in the congregation, it has to be somebody that you have a deep covenantal relationship with.
Let me give you a scenario. You're a first-time youth minister in a congregation. You've been there maybe 9 months at this point, and you've got a vision for where youth ministry needs to go, which is going to require some significant changes in the congregation's outlook on youth ministry and how they've gone about doing it. What's your first step in putting that vision through?
9 months in. The challenges of doing that 9 months in is that your relationships within that congregation are all young. And so to move a vision forward, the best visions are visions that are cast by a group of people. And so one of the dangers that young youth ministers face is that they impose their vision on a church that may or may not share it. A lot of people have lost their job or quit their job because they wanted to do their vision and they didn't get people on board to have a collective vision. So my biggest recommendation would be that you have a youth ministry team or youth council, or you've got your group of volunteers who are helping you collectively work through what your vision, the vision for the congregation should look like in that context. You want to get other staff on board with that, get their feedback and their input so that they too feel like they've bought into what you're saying. And then communication chain is extraordinarily important with the senior pastor and others, because if your vision changes a lot of things, when people start to get upset about change, which they do, you're going to want the support of those who are in leadership in the congregation to say, yes, we're aware of this, and this is something we believe and are supporting, and change takes time, so we'll